I'll rewrite this historical narrative about the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective, maintaining all the facts and details while changing the voice and structure. Before the sun broke over the Pacific horizon on that 4th day of June 1942, countless young aviators from Japan found themselves sealed within their cockpits aboard the decks of 4 massive carriers, pulling deep breaths of the cool maritime air into their lungs. Down below in the briefing spaces, other flyers pored over target photographs one more time, committing every detail to memory. Mechanics and flight deck handlers swarmed over aircraft, tightening bolts and checking fuel lines, making certain everything would function perfectly when the moment arrived. None of them could have known that roughly 240 miles distant to the northeast, 3 American flat tops were already positioning themselves, their bows pointed into the wind, crews scrambling to get their own strike packages airborne. The coming hours would transform what Japanese planners had envisioned as their crowning achievement, the final destruction of American naval aviation in the Pacific, into an unmitigated catastrophe for the empire. Those 4 Japanese carriers, the very ships that had delivered such devastating blows at Pearl Harbor mere months earlier, would soon be resting on the ocean floor, carrying with them not merely tons of steel and aviation fuel, but also the aspirations of Japanese territorial expansion and more than 3,000 trained airmen and seamen whose skills could never be replaced. This moment represented the peak of half a year's worth of unbroken triumphs, and for the first time this crucial engagement would be examined through the perspective of those on the losing side, the Japanese admirals who conceived the operation, the airmen who executed it, and the sailors who perished in its flames. This was Midway. During the spring months of 1942, roughly 2 months prior to the catastrophe that would unfold at Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who held the position of Commander-in-Chief for the combined fleet, found himself engaged in contentious disputes with the Naval General Staff within Tokyo. Contrary to what the Japanese public had been led to believe, matters were not proceeding as smoothly as official pronouncements suggested. The Pearl Harbor operation the previous December, despite its tactical excellence, had completely failed to eliminate even 1 American aircraft carrier. This stark reality consumed Yamamoto's thoughts constantly. Both the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington had been away from port when the attack occurred, and now, half a year later, these carriers continued launching strikes against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific theater. The situation deteriorated further on the 18th of April, when American B-25 medium bombers, having launched from the carrier USS Hornet, suddenly materialized in the skies above Tokyo itself. This Doolittle raid represented an inconceivable disgrace for the Japanese military establishment, which had given solemn promises to shield the emperor from any threat. While the raid inflicted relatively minor physical destruction, it created profound psychological shockwaves within Japanese leadership circles. The vulnerability of the sacred homeland had been laid bare, and accountability had to be assigned to someone. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the officer who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike, experienced particular distress. Critics had targeted him for declining to authorize a 3rd attack wave at Pearl Harbor, for failing to locate the American carriers, and now the capital city itself had been subjected to aerial bombardment. The pressure to undertake some decisive action became overwhelming, yet Japanese high command remained, as it typically was, severely fractured in its thinking. Within the power structure's hallways, 2 conflicting strategic approaches took shape. The Naval General Staff, characterized by conservatism and caution, pushed for a southward strategy, arguing for consolidation of existing territorial gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea regions, thereby severing the supply routes connecting America to Australia. Yamamoto, however, possessed an entirely different conception, one stemming from both perceived opportunity and mounting desperation. He grasped something that few others within Japan genuinely comprehended. Time favored the enemy, not the empire. Throughout his years spent in America, including his studies at Harvard and his service as a naval attaché, Yamamoto had observed American industrial capacity with his own eyes. He had toured the steel production facilities in Pittsburgh, visited the shipbuilding yards at Newport News, witnessed the seemingly endless agricultural lands capable of sustaining millions of factory workers. Once the American war production apparatus reached its full operational capacity, Japan would find itself buried under sheer material superiority. In a conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye that was documented from 1940, Yamamoto stated that if ordered to wage war, he could promise a vigorous fight for the initial 6 months, but held absolutely zero confidence regarding what might transpire should the conflict extend for 2 or 3 years. This forecast would demonstrate prophetic accuracy. In another verified statement from September 1941, he had cautioned that for a brief period Japan would enjoy complete dominance, expanding in all directions like an octopus extending its tentacles, but this advantage would persist for at most 18 months. Yamamoto's proposed solution took the form of Operation MI, the seizure of Midway Atoll. This minuscule pair of islands, encompassing merely 6 square miles of coral formations and sandy beaches, possessed strategic value far exceeding its physical dimensions. Positioned 1,100 miles to the northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway functioned as America's furthest western base, serving as an essential refueling location for submarines and patrol aircraft operating throughout the Central Pacific. Yet even more significantly for Yamamoto's purposes, Midway would function as bait, irresistible bait that would compel the American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor. When they arrived to defend the atoll, the numerically superior Japanese fleet would annihilate them in a climactic engagement, the decisive fleet action that Japanese naval theory had always anticipated. The plan exhibited complexity, arguably excessive complexity. It required multiple forces maneuvering across thousands of miles of open water. An invasion flotilla to capture Midway, a carrier striking force to eliminate American air power, a main body equipped with battleships, including Yamamoto's own flagship, the formidable Yamato, and even a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands intended to mislead the Americans. Approximately 200 vessels in total, constituting the largest armada Japan had ever assembled. The operation order by itself extended to 700 pages, distributed to subordinate commanders merely days before departure, providing them with barely adequate time to comprehend it. Opposition to the scheme proved substantial, though ultimately ineffective. Rear Admiral Motomi Ugaki, serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff, supervised war games during early May that produced troubling outcomes. During these tabletop simulations, the American carriers materialized earlier than projections indicated and delivered serious damage to the Japanese fleet. Yet these findings were literally overruled by the exercise umpires, who arbitrarily diminished American successes and refloated Japanese vessels that had been deemed sunk during the exercises. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the exceptional tactical architect who had devised the Pearl Harbor attack, voiced reservations about the operation's intricacy and the carrier's exposure to risk, his concerns were brushed aside. The victory disease, that lethal overconfidence born from 6 months of effortless conquests, had contaminated even the most capable intellects within the Imperial Navy. Japanese intelligence estimated they had destroyed 2 American carriers during the Coral Sea engagement in May. In reality, they had sunk only one, the USS Lexington. They presumed the USS Yorktown had sustained such severe damage she would remain non-operational for months. Japanese intelligence services failed to identify the frantic repair work underway at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers labored continuously to patch Yorktown in merely 3 days, an accomplishment Japanese shipyards could never have replicated. They calculated the Americans could field at most 2 functioning carriers to oppose them. Meanwhile, the officer selected to command the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, nursed his own profound misgivings. Nagumo was not a carrier specialist by either training or disposition. A torpedo warfare expert who had received appointment to lead the First Air Fleet primarily through seniority rather than specialized knowledge, he had never felt comfortable with naval aviation. At Pearl Harbor, his cautious nature had prevented a third strike wave that might have obliterated the American fuel storage facilities and repair infrastructure. Now he was being tasked with directing an even more intricate operation using an increasingly exhausted force. His carriers had been continuously at sea since Pearl Harbor, conducting strikes against Darwin, Ceylon, and supporting operations spanning from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His air crews were depleted, and the ships required maintenance. Most alarmingly, the recent Coral Sea battle during May had exacted a heavy toll on Japan. While tactically a Japanese success with the destruction of Lexington, strategically it represented a setback. The carrier Shokaku had suffered extensive damage and would need months of yard work. Her sister vessel Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and aviators that she could not participate in the Midway operation. Two of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from the decisive confrontation. As Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, they were being asked to accomplish too much with insufficient resources. The Americans had been granted time to prepare. His pilots were fatigued, and Japanese forces didn't even know the location of the enemy carriers. Yamamoto was gambling with the Empire's destiny. Perhaps the most catastrophic weakness in the Japanese scheme involved intelligence and attitude. Unknown to the Japanese, the Americans had cracked the Japanese Navy's JN-25B communications code. Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor had been deciphering Japanese transmissions since early 1942. The Americans knew about Operation MY, understood the target designation, and Admiral Chester Nimitz had concentrated his available carriers at what would become the perfect ambush position northeast of Midway. The planned reconnaissance overflight of Pearl Harbor, designated Operation K, was scrubbed when the submarine I-123 discovered American destroyers USS Thornton and USS Ballard occupying French frigate shoals, the designated refueling location. This technique had functioned in March when two Kawanishi flying boats had refueled from submarines there to bomb Oahu, but Nimitz had absorbed lessons from that incursion. Systematically, the reconnaissance assets that might have detected the American trap were being neutralized. Radio intelligence data suggested elevated American submarine activity and communication traffic around Midway. The facility with which the Americans had intercepted Japanese forces at Coral Sea hinted their codes might be compromised, but these indications were dismissed. As one staff officer characterized it, the Americans were too intellectually limited to break Japanese codes and too cowardly to fight unless possessing crushing superiority. They would approach Midway only after Japanese forces had secured it, and then they would be destroyed. On the 27th of May, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's magnificent triumph over the Russians at Tsushima, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, departed from the inland sea. 4 carriers set sail: Akagi, meaning Red Castle, Yamamoto's previous command, and now Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, signifying increased joy, the converted battleship, Hiryu, translating to Flying Dragon, and Soryu, meaning Green Dragon. Collectively, they embarked with 248 aircraft, including 21 Zeros being transported to Midway, leaving 225 operational for combat operations, and the world's most seasoned naval aviators. These represented the ships and personnel who had ravaged Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon. Surely nothing could halt them. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from his emergency appendectomy yet serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his medical condition, recorded a final entry in his personal diary before sailing. They departed with troubled spirits. This operation had been hurried, their intelligence remained inadequate, and the plan exhibited excessive complexity. But they were warriors. They would execute their obligations even if it resulted in death. May divine protection shield Japan, for he feared they sailed toward disaster. The fatal weakness of excessive confidence was perhaps best demonstrated by the handling of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike. During late May, Fuchida underwent an emergency appendectomy aboard Akagi. The surgical procedure left him too debilitated to fly, depriving the Japanese of their most accomplished strike commander at the most crucial juncture. According to subsequent testimony from fellow officers, Fuchida observed the preparations from his hospital bed with mounting anxiety, sensing that everything about this operation felt incorrect. The scheduling, the planning, the very atmosphere itself seemed weighted with approaching catastrophe. However, historians acknowledge that Fuchida's post-war narratives must be evaluated cautiously, as contemporary scholarship has questioned numerous his assertions. During the pre-dawn hours of June 3rd, 600 miles northward, the Aleutian Islands operation commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Strike Force, equipped with the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, initiated strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This was intended to serve as the grand diversion, drawing American forces northward while Nagumo attacked Midway. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had not swallowed the deception. Admiral Chester Nimitz, completely informed by his codebreakers regarding the actual objective, had maintained his carriers near Midway. The sophisticated deception had fooled nobody except the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers steamed through fogbanks toward their launch position, preserving absolute radio silence that would prevent any coordination between the widely dispersed forces. Within the ready rooms, aviators received their concluding briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, designated to command the first strike, examined the reconnaissance photographs of Midway one final time. The imagery was weeks outdated, yet it displayed the airfield, the fuel storage tanks, the defensive emplacements. What it failed to reveal was the recent strengthening of the island, the additional fighters, bombers, and most critically, the radar installation that would identify the Japanese strike while it remained 93 miles distant. That evening, American PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted elements of the Japanese invasion flotilla 700 miles west of Midway. This initial contact electrified the American command structure. Navy aviator Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, transmitted at 0925 hours, sighted main body, bearing 262, distance 700. Yet Nagumo's carriers remained undetected, concealed by meteorological conditions and distance. On Akagi's bridge, the atmosphere was tense. Chief of Staff Kusaka approached Nagumo, noting that if the Americans had identified the invasion force, they might demonstrate greater vigilance than anticipated. Nagumo dismissed the apprehension. The invasion force was supposed to be observed. It would draw them forth. Tomorrow, Japanese forces would eliminate their air power on Midway, and when their carriers arrived to mount a counterattack, Japanese forces would be prepared. Yet even as Nagumo articulated these assured words, 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard USS Enterprise, was calculating the Japanese carrier forces' likely coordinates. The American carriers occupied exactly the position they shouldn't occupy, per Japanese calculations. Already deployed, already positioned, already organizing to strike. Task Force 16 under Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with the rapidly repaired Yorktown, had achieved Point Luck, their designated meeting point northeast of Midway, undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance. The meteorological conditions were favorable, the ocean relatively calm, ideal aviation weather with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 0430 hours, Akagi and Kaga commenced launching the initial wave against Midway. The launch executed flawlessly. 36 Aichi dive bombers, 36 Nakajima-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga guided them into the brightening sky, circling once above the fleet before proceeding southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. As the 108th aircraft assembled and departed, Nagumo rendered his first consequential decision of the day. Despite doctrine mandating a full deckload strike to maximize striking power, He retained 108 aircraft, torpedo bombers armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs in case American naval vessels materialized. It appeared prudent, yet it would prove disastrous. Below decks, within Akagi's hangar, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida monitored the launch from his sickbed, still recuperating from his appendectomy. The absence of his expertise and tactical acumen would be acutely felt in the approaching hours. According to witness statements from fellow officers, Fuchida voiced profound apprehension about the operation, though his exact words remain unconfirmed in contemporary records. At 0500 hours, Nagumo launched his reconnaissance aircraft, merely 7 aircraft to survey a massive expanse of ocean. By comparison, the Americans had over 30 PBYs searching for the Japanese fleet. Most significantly, the search plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, identified as No. 4 Scout and assigned to patrol the sector where the American carriers actually were positioned, launched 30 minutes behind schedule. Various accounts attribute this to catapult malfunctions, though some suggest engine difficulties or administrative delays. This singular mechanical breakdown would cascade into catastrophe. Ironically, recent historical analysis suggests that had the aircraft launched punctually, its search configuration might have bypassed the American task forces completely. At 0534 hours, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey detected the Japanese carriers and broadcast the thrilling transmission: "Enemy carriers." He supplemented with additional detail at 0552 hours. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180, course 135, speed 25. On Enterprise, Spruance rendered a command judgment that would shape the battle's result. Despite the extreme distance, approaching 200 miles, he directed an immediate strike. His aircraft would possess barely adequate fuel to return, yet he desired to engage the Japanese when they exhibited maximum vulnerability, recovering their midway strike. Meanwhile, at 0553 hours, radar on Midway identified the approaching Japanese strike 93 miles outbound. Air raid warnings blared across the diminutive atoll. Every serviceable aircraft was scrambled. Bombers to assault the Japanese fleet, fighters to defend. Marine fighters launched skyward, 20 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and 7 Grumman Wildcat fighters. They faced numerical disadvantage of 4-1 against the escorting Zeros. The interception transpired at 0616 hours. Marine Major Floyd Parks, commanding the defenders, transmitted his final radio communication. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. The slaughter proved swift and merciless. The Zeros, possessing superior maneuverability and veteran pilots, shredded the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were obliterated, 4 critically damaged. Major Parks numbered among the deceased. The Zeros forfeited merely 3 aircraft. At 0630 hours, Tomonaga's strike force materialized over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers conducted their attacks with exactness, igniting fuel storage tanks, demolishing structures, cratering the runway. Yet as Tomonaga circled to evaluate damage, he observed something disturbing. American aircraft continued departing from the supposedly neutralized airfield. The runway, while damaged, remained functional. Most significantly, none of the American aircraft had been caught on the surface. They had all been launched before the strike arrived. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo. There exists need for a second attack wave. This transmission reached Nagumo at 0700 hours, precisely as the initial American strikes from Midway began arriving. First appeared 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes. The Zeros, assigned to combat air patrol, swarmed them. 5 Avengers were destroyed, 2 B-26 eliminated. Yet 1 B-26, nicknamed Susie Q and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, executed a desperate approach directly at Akagi after releasing his torpedo. According to multiple Japanese witnesses, including bridge staff, the bomber thundered down the length of Akagi's flight deck, its gunners strafing and killing 2 seamen. The aircraft ascended at the final instant, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his personnel ducked for protection. Muri's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet perforations and lost hydraulic fluid, yet somehow returned to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and severely damaged, actually plunged into the ocean adjacent to Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting an intentional ramming assault. This near catastrophe produced a profound psychological impact. As Captain Kusaka would subsequently testify, the Admiral exhibited visible distress. To have an enemy aircraft nearly collide with the bridge represented as though the war deity had delivered them a warning. Additional American attacks materialized in rapid sequence. 16 Marine dive bombers commanded by Major Lofton Henderson, who would perish leading his squadron. 15 B-17 bombers bombing from elevated altitude. 11 Marine Vindicators. All were repelled with substantial casualties, achieving no hits, yet they maintained the Japanese carriers dodging and maneuvering, unable to execute flight operations efficiently. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo confronted a critical judgment. His reserve aircraft were equipped with armor-piercing ordnance and torpedoes for naval attack. Yet Tomonaga required reinforcement at Midway, and no enemy carriers had been identified. Following intense discussion with his staff, Nagumo issued the directive that determined his destiny: remove torpedoes, load land attack bombs. This contravened Yamamoto's explicit directives to preserve readiness for anti-ship operations. Down within the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, pandemonium erupted. Ordnance personnel commenced the laborious procedure of extracting Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, substituting them with smaller land attack munitions. Contrary to regulations and safety protocols, the extracted torpedoes were accumulated in the hangar areas, rather than being transported to the magazines deep below, as there wasn't time. Bombs were stacked adjacent to the aircraft. Fuel conduits snaked everywhere as planes were refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mori, would subsequently testify had he survived, the hangar deck resembled a bomb manufacturing facility. One ignition, and they would all perish. At 07:28 hours, everything transformed. The Tone's delayed scout aircraft, number 4, finally transmitted. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface vessels bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed exceeding 20 knots. Nagumo immediately signaled, "Ascertain vessel types." The response didn't arrive for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the rearming continued, the hangar decks becoming progressively cluttered with ordnance. At 07:45 hours, another American strike materialized. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241 commanded by Major Henderson. The Zeros savaged them, destroying 8, yet the attacks persisted, compelling violent evasive maneuvers that prevented flight operations. Nagumo was ensnared in an impossible situation. His fighters were depleting fuel and ammunition from combating continuous attacks. Tomonaga's strike force would return imminently, also fuel depleted. His decks were spotted with aircraft being rearmed, and somewhere distant were American surface vessels, potentially carriers. At 0809 hours, Tone number 4 Scout finally clarified. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo experienced relief, no carriers, and continued rearming for a second Midway strike. Yet at 0820 hours, another transmission demolished his composure. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signaled Nagumo at 0830 hours. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, combative and resolute, perceived the peril distinctly. Every minute of postponement intensified vulnerability, yet Nagumo wavered. His aircraft existed in disarray. Some equipped with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed whatsoever. His fighters required landing and refueling. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching. To launch presently would necessitate a partial, uncoordinated assault without fighter protection, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda, despite his illness from the appendectomy, was consulted. According to staff officer testimonies, he advocated for immediate launch. Speed constitutes everything now. Launch what we possess. Yet Captain Kusaka recommended caution. If we attack piecemeal, we'll sustain heavy casualties for minimal achievement. Better to recover our aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. Nagumo, perpetually cautious, perpetually adherent to procedures, aligned with Kusaka. They would recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel appropriately, and subsequently strike with complete strength. He signalled all carriers. After completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy. This determination, logical, prudent, and utterly erroneous, sealed the Kido Butai's destiny. As Tomonaga's aircraft landed, commencing at 08:37 hours, and were struck below to be refueled and rearmed, the hangar decks became killing zones. Fuel lines pervaded everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes were distributed about. The constant cycling of elevators transported planes upward and downward. Safety protocols were entirely abandoned in the urgency to prepare for launch. Nobody observed the initial American torpedo aircraft appearing on the horizon until too late. At 09:20 hours, the initial American carrier aircraft arrived. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter protection, flying antiquated aircraft at merely 100 knots, barely above the surface, they pressed inward against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros on combat air patrol, finally confronting worthy adversaries after hours of combating land-based strikes, descended like predators on prey. The massacre proved absolute. Individually, the slow, defenseless torpedo bombers were eliminated. All 15 were annihilated. Of 30 aircrew, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water, concealing himself under his seat cushion, observing the remainder of the engagement unfold. Not a solitary torpedo connected, yet Waldron's sacrifice proved meaningful. The Zeros were all attracted down to ocean level, concentrated on the torpedo aircraft. At 09:54 hours, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 materialized, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Again, the Zeros swarmed downward. 10 were obliterated, 4 escaped. No strikes. At 10:00 hours, 12 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attacked, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 additional destroyed. Still no torpedo connections. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. It appeared another slaughter for nothing. On Akagi's bridge, there existed relief, even jubilation. The American attacks had been deflected with catastrophic losses. Nagumo directed the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30 hours. Triumph seemed attainable. Yet elevated above, unnoticed with every Zero at ocean level, 2 formations of SBD Dauntless dive bombers materialized simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched beyond his calculated interception coordinates, wagering his fuel to locate the Japanese. He had identified the destroyer Arashi speeding northward, which had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus, and tracked its course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from an alternate direction at the identical moment. At 10:20 hours, lookouts on Akagi screamed warnings, hell divers. Yet it was too late. With the Zeros at ocean level, with the decks congested with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes dispersed throughout the hangar areas, the Japanese carriers exhibited perfect vulnerability. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below expanded, becoming flawless targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey directed his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best diverted his division against Akagi. Almost concurrently, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plummeted towards Soryu. The Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive actions and with their decks crowded with aircraft, were engaged at their most defenseless moment. On Kaga, 4 bombs connected in rapid succession. The initial 1,000-pounder detonated near the bridge at 10:22 hours, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command personnel instantly. The second penetrated the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs converted the vessel into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga constituted a floating pyre with ammunition detonating and aviation fuel generating walls of flame. Akagi absorbed merely one direct strike at 10:24 hours from Lieutenant Best's bomb, yet it sufficed. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The induced explosions of the improperly stored ordnance proved catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated, bombs exploded, and aviation fuel generated an unstoppable conflagration. Bridge staff reported that within 2 minutes, the complete hangar deck constituted an inferno with temperatures surpassing 1,000 degrees Celsius. Soryu endured 3 direct strikes in her hangar spaces at 10:25 hours. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers positioned their ordnance with lethal precision. 13 dive bombers, 3 Zeros, and 4 torpedo bombers on the flight deck were demolished. Below, within the hangars, the accumulated torpedoes and bombs generated secondary explosions that tore through the vessel's vital systems. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, declined to abandon his burning vessel. According to the testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, dispatched to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last observed on the bridge, sword in grasp, singing the national anthem, Kimigayo, as flames consumed the command structure. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by cloud formations, escaped. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately organized a counterstrike, yet 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking capability had been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58 hours, even as the 3 carriers burned, Yamaguchi launched 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts commanded by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Tracking the American aircraft's return path, they located Yorktown at 1200 hours. Despite vigorous resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they achieved 3 bomb strikes, leaving the American carrier immobilized, burning and listing. Damage control parties labored frantically, and incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown was underway again, achieving 20 knots. Yamaguchi, combative to the conclusion, immediately organized a second strike. At 13:31 hours, only 10 torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros were available, commanded by Lieutenant Tomonaga. During the morning midway strike, Tomonaga's left-wing fuel reservoir had been damaged. Maintenance personnel only possessed time to fuel his right tank. Offered an opportunity to exchange aircraft, Tomonaga declined, declaring every aircraft was required. He understood it constituted a one-way mission. His fuel would only suffice for the attack approach. At 14:30 hours, Tomonaga's small force located Yorktown, now achieving 19 knots after heroic damage control achievements. American fighters tore into the formation. Tomonaga maintained his course, despite his aircraft catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft sustained its torpedo run until the very final moment, releasing its torpedo before plunging into the sea. 2 torpedoes connected with Yorktown at 14:45 hours, tearing open her port side and producing a 26-degree list. This time, the damage proved fatal, yet at 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu. 4 bombs converted her into another inferno at 17:03 hours. Yamaguchi assembled his personnel on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and reconstruct a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both selected to descend with their vessel. Their remains were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final transmission to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat and an aspiration for the emperor's fortune in war. He received posthumous promotion to vice admiral. Throughout the night of June 4th to 5th, the surviving Japanese vessels attempted damage control, yet it proved hopeless. Soryu descended at 19:13 hours on the 4th with 711 personnel. Kaga followed at 19:25 hours, transporting 811 seamen to the depths. At 00:25 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto, still 600 miles distant aboard his flagship Yamato, with the main body that never engaged, finally accepted reality. He signaled, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Withdraw." Akagi proved surprisingly resistant to destruction. Despite the raging fires, she remained afloat through the night. At 0500 hours on June 5th, after all surviving crew had been evacuated, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her. She sank at 0520 hours with 267 casualties. Hiryu followed at 0230 hours with 392 personnel. As the sun rose on June 5th, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force rested on the Pacific floor in water exceeding 17,000 feet deep. With them were 3,570 personnel. Of these, 2,181 perished on the carriers. Akagi forfeited 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, and Soryu 711. Another 792 perished on the heavy cruisers when Mikuma was destroyed with 700 casualties and Mogami damaged with 92 dead after they collided during nocturnal operations and were intercepted by American aircraft. Critically, only 110 were aircrew. Most aviators were rescued. The greater irreplaceable loss constituted over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics and flight deck staff, whose expertise had required years to develop. The survivors retrieved by destroyers were immediately segregated from the remainder of the fleet to prevent information of the catastrophe from disseminating. They were confined below decks, prohibited from communicating with anyone. The disaster wasn't quite concluded. On June 6th, the submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, discovered the crippled Yorktown under tow by USS Vireo. Tanabe had been off Midway providing meteorological reports and had observed the morning attacks through his periscope. Now, penetrating through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he accomplished what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31 hours, Tanabe discharged a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 struck Yorktown, 1 struck the destroyer Hammond alongside, providing auxiliary power. Hammond fractured in 2 and descended in 4 minutes with 80 casualties, many killed by her own depth charges exploding. Yorktown, struck by 2 additional torpedoes, was doomed, yet declined to descend immediately. She finally rolled over and descended at 0701 hours on June 7th in approximately 16,650 feet of water. This small consolation, destroying the carrier that had assisted in eliminating the Kido Butai, barely registered against the magnitude of the Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th, had collided while avoiding submarine assault. American aircraft discovered them on June 6th. Mikuma was destroyed with 700 personnel, the highest casualty count of any Japanese vessel at Midway. Mogami, extensively damaged and with 92 casualties, barely returned to Truk. The catastrophe was absolute. The journey homeward constituted one of disgrace and silence. Wounded seamen from the carriers were maintained isolated in special compartments. Nobody was permitted to discuss what transpired. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night to avoid observation. The wounded were offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and transported to isolated naval hospitals, where they were maintained under virtual detention, quarantined even from their own families. They were forbidden any contact with the external world. According to US Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner as disgraced losers. The survivors of the air groups were immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being permitted to see families or friends. The majority would perish in the subsequent engagements of the Solomon Islands campaign. The carrier personnel were dispersed to different vessels and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. The systematic concealment commenced immediately. The government prepared its propaganda. The destroyed carriers Akagi and Soryu remained on the official roster as operational to preserve the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would necessitate acknowledging defeat. Information about the defeat was withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army for a complete month. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was maintained in ignorance about the complete extent of the catastrophe. On June 5th, while the vessels still burned, Tokyo Radio had announced to the Japanese population, "Naval and air forces of the Empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific." Subsequent broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another crushing triumph, with 2 American carriers destroyed. Initially, the loss of one carrier, Kaga, was acknowledged, with Soryu's loss admitted subsequently. Akagi and Soryu's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. The Japanese population celebrated in the streets, unaware they were applauding a catastrophe. It wasn't until June 10th that the Tokyo press first suggested problems, employing vague language about difficulties in the operation, yet still preserving the fiction of overall triumph. Commander Fuchida, recuperating in the hospital from his appendectomy and burns received during Akagi's destruction, was visited by a naval intelligence officer who cautioned him, "You are forbidden to speak of what occurred. As far as the world knows, we won a magnificent victory." According to post-war accounts that must be evaluated cautiously given questions about Fuchida's reliability, he responded with bitter irony about the futility of constructing a war on falsehoods, though this exchange cannot be independently confirmed. Admiral Yamamoto returned to his cabin aboard Yamato and didn't emerge for 3 days. His staff heard him pacing at night, tormented by his failure. To his diary, he confided thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into profound depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoye had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In a private meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. "I gambled and lost. In attempting to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." To his close friend, Rear Admiral Teikichi Hori, he would later compose a letter that survived the war. The defeat at Midway was not a matter of misfortune or enemy superiority in numbers. It was the consequence of our own overconfidence and inadequate planning. We underestimated American capabilities and overestimated our own. Now we will pay the price for our hubris. I give Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation becomes completely hopeless. His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would forfeit the Marianas, and American bombers would be within range of the home islands. The authentic cost of Midway extends far beyond the 4 carriers and 3,057 dead. Japan has forfeited over 100 of its finest pilots, personnel with years of training and combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, which requires 2 years minimum to produce a combat-ready aviator and far longer to create an expert, cannot replace them. More critically, the 700-plus skilled aircraft mechanics, armourers and flight deck crew who perished represent institutional knowledge that required decades to develop. These personnel knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carriers' operations. As Admiral Akagi writes in his diary, later captured and translated, "We can construct new carriers in 2 years. We cannot construct new pilots with the experience of those we lost, and we will never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep our aircraft flying under combat conditions." The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the personnel. Japanese naval aviation never recovers. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 years later in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots will be massacred in what Americans designate the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators, flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft, forfeit over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that catastrophe were planted in the waters off Midway. Midway marks the conclusion of Japanese expansion. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, the reality slowly penetrates despite the propaganda. The planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa and Hawaii are quietly cancelled. The proposed Operation FS to sever the supply lines between America and Australia is abandoned. Instead, Japan is compelled into a defensive war it cannot win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, commence planning their counter-offensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months distant, will initiate the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact proves equally devastating. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since the triumph over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, is demolished forever. As one destroyer captain, Commander Tamechi Hara, recalled in his memoirs, "After Midway, we never felt confident again. We entered battle expecting to lose. The Americans entered expecting to win." The whole psychology of the war had transformed in those 5 minutes when our carriers were struck. Within the Navy itself, bitter recriminations commence immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo, made a scapegoat for the defeat despite following orthodox doctrine, is relegated to shore duty. He will never command carriers again. In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, where he commands ground forces, he commits suicide rather than face capture. Admiral Akagi writes in his diary, "Nagumo is finished as a commander. The blame must fall on someone, and it cannot be Yamamoto." The defeat also exposes fundamental weaknesses in Japanese military culture. The inflexibility of thinking, the inability to adapt to unexpected situations, the blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances change, all these cultural characteristics that contribute to the defeat are recognized but cannot be changed. The same rigid hierarchy and thinking that led to disaster at Midway will be repeated again and again throughout the war. Post-war analysis reveals the cascade of failures that led to disaster. The Japanese operation was too complex, with forces scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support each other. Radio silence, maintained religiously, prevented any coordination when plans went awry. Intelligence was abysmal. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were already deployed, while the Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans thanks to their code-breaking. The failure of reconnaissance was particularly damning. Only 7 search planes to cover a vast ocean area, compared to over 30 American PBY Catalinas. The cancelled Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor due to American presence at French frigate shoals. The submarine cordon arriving too late to detect American carriers departing Pearl Harbor. The Tone's crucial 30-minute delay in launching its scout plane. Each failure individually might not have been fatal. Together, they guaranteed disaster. Perhaps most critically, the Japanese underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They presumed Americans couldn't break their codes. They had. They presumed Yorktown couldn't be repaired quickly. She was fixed in 72 hours. They presumed American pilots were inferior. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. They presumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured. They were waiting in ambush. The damage control failures were equally telling. Japanese carriers had open hangar decks with inadequate compartmentalization. American carriers with enclosed hangar decks and superior damage control proved far more survivable. Yorktown absorbed tremendous punishment and might have survived if not for the submarine attack. The Japanese carriers burned catastrophically from single hits due to poor fuel system design and inadequate ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto does not long survive the defeat he knew doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercept his travel schedule. P-38 Lightning fighters intercept his plane over Bougainville and shoot it down. His death, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had precipitated Midway, seems almost poetic justice. Found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat, sword at his side, Yamamoto takes to his grave the full knowledge of how Japan lost the war in those 5 minutes at Midway. Before his death, in one of his last letters to a friend that survived the war, Yamamoto reflected with remarkable clarity. At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spiritual strength alone. They are won by intelligence, both kinds, good information, and the wisdom to use it properly. We had neither. We were too proud to believe the Americans could be waiting for us, too rigid to adapt when our plans went wrong, too proud to admit our codes might be broken. Pride precedes the fall, and our pride was limitless. The result was inevitable. The greatest irony of Midway is that it achieved Yamamoto's goal just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive engagement he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. The carriers he had tried to trap had instead trapped him. The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered. The decisive battle doctrine that Japanese naval strategy had been constructed upon for 40 years was proven correct, but it was the Americans who won it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might. In early 1942, he told his staff, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." At Midway, that counterattack arrived with devastating efficiency. The Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had turned Japanese strategy against them. The war would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Yet beyond the strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally a human tragedy. In the waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen perished. Young personnel who had written final letters to their families that morning, who had shared rice and tea for breakfast, who had dreams of triumph and home. They perished in flames that reached 1,000 degrees, drowned in oil-slicked waters, or were torn apart by explosions that could be heard miles distant. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few survivors from Akagi's engine room, testified at post-war investigations. "The screams of burning personnel echo in my nightmares still. We couldn't save them. The passages were blocked by fire, the ladders melted from heat. We could only listen as they perished, their voices calling for their mothers, for water, for death to end their agony. Every night I hear them still. The families back home never learned the truth during the war. They received notices that their sons perished gloriously for the Emperor in a magnificent triumph. Mothers displayed gold stars in their windows, proud of their sacrifice, never knowing it was for a defeat that sealed Japan's fate. The truth would only emerge after the war, adding betrayal to grief. Many families refused to believe it even then, so complete had been the deception. Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived Soryu's sinking, recalled the morning before the engagement. "We were so confident. We joked about which American vessel we would destroy. Yamada said he would sink a battleship. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American aircraft. They were both 18 years old. Both perished when the bombs struck. Their remains were never recovered. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for directives that will never come. Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of water. Their exact locations only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They are war graves, monuments to the price of hubris and the cost of war. The aircraft that once launched from their decks to spread destruction across the Pacific lie crumpled in their hangar bays. The remains of their crews remain at their battle stations, eternal guardians of vessels that will never sail again. From the Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality. It was proof that spiritual strength alone cannot overcome material weakness, that courage without intelligence leads to disaster, that rigid thinking cannot adapt to fluid situations. It was Japan's appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. The Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered illusions, the myth of Japanese invincibility, the faith in spiritual superiority over material strength, the belief that determination could overcome any odds. All perished with the carriers. In their place came the grim recognition that Japan had started a war it could not win, against an enemy it had fatally underestimated, using strategies that modern warfare had rendered obsolete. Yet from the ashes of defeat came a different Japan, one that renounced war, embraced democracy, and became a force for peace and prosperity. The warrior spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. The nation that once sought to dominate the Pacific now helps maintain its peace. The technological expertise that once constructed carriers now constructs automobiles and computers. In that transformation, perhaps the 3,057 who perished at Midway did not perish entirely in vain. The engagement also stands as a warning to all nations about the dangers of overconfidence and rigid thinking. The Japanese military, despite its tactical brilliance and courageous personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease, the assumption that what worked before will always work, that the enemy will act as expected, that superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage, infected decision-making at every level. The same Navy that had brilliantly executed the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier now bungled basic reconnaissance, ignored intelligence warnings, and walked into a trap that should have been obvious. As we look back at Midway from the Japanese perspective, we see not villains, but human beings caught in the terrible machinery of war. Young aviators who flew to their deaths with courage, if not wisdom. Commanders making decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure. Mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they would never see again. Seamen fighting fires that could not be controlled, staying at their posts until the conclusion. Their story deserves to be told not to glorify defeat or war, but to remember the cost of military aggression and the price of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, despite the questions about his post-war reliability, perhaps captured something essential when he became a Christian evangelist after the war and spent his remaining years preaching reconciliation. Though his specific accounts must be treated cautiously, his transformation from architect of Pearl Harbor to advocate for peace represents the journey Japan itself took. From aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. The lesson of Midway from the Japanese perspective is ultimately that no nation, no matter how powerful, can afford to underestimate its enemies, overestimate its capabilities, or ignore the changing realities of warfare. The same carriers that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally vulnerable at Midway. The same pilots who had swept all before them met their match in American dive bombers. The same strategies that had worked against divided enemies failed against a united and informed opponent. In the end, this is Midway from the Japanese perspective, a story of pride before the fall, of human error compounding into catastrophe, of young lives sacrificed for strategic miscalculation. It's a story that deserves to be told not to celebrate defeat or victory, but to remember the cost of war and the price of empire. For in the end, the waves that closed over the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waves that would eventually wash clean the stains of militarism, leaving behind a nation transformed and a lesson for all humanity, that the path of aggression leads only to destruction, and that true strength lies not in conquest, but in peace. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us that war is not glorious but terrible, not triumphant but tragic, and that peace, however difficult to maintain, is always preferable to even the most decisive victory. In the vast Pacific, where the carriers still lie in their deep graves, the only sound is the eternal movement of the waves, carrying neither Japanese nor American voices, but simply the echo of humanity's costliest lesson, that war, no matter who wins, leaves only loss in its wake.